thank you very much for being our guest tonight, and it's very lovely to have you. And we often begin, George, mischievously by asking people to describe the room that they are in, because we couldn't see this if we were listening to you at a literary festival. But we can glimpse inside, and there's somebody in the door peering. Your door mysteriously is closing.
That's my lovely wife, Frances.
Marvelous, Frances. There you are. It could be one of those Korean embarrassments that's going to go with that Korean academic. George, where are we here?
So I'm in my study. It's a balmy evening here, which is why I'm dressed like this. Balmy evening here in London. I overlook, actually, this is in Hackney, overlook reservoirs. I can see people open water swimming out there about 100 meters from where I am. And actually, this is the business about people having a peek into your front room and so on. I did suddenly think, oh my God, are there any photographs I should take down? But I think I'm safe. I think I'm quite happy for people to see those. But I'm told it's a liability of Zoom meetings, and several people I'm told just find the most innocuous empty room they can to do these things.
Or blur it out, but no, I mean it's interesting to know. And is this where you sit and write and think, or
well, it's interesting.
Where's your creativity come?
I do. But there's a lot of sort of the admin-y stuff, and journalism goes on here. When I've written I've got 3 books that I've written. I've tended to go away. Actually, we're very, very fortunate. We go to Cornwall quite a lot, and it seems a long way to go, 250 miles, just to start hitting the keyboard. But as you know, having written so many books, it's psychological, and somehow you associate a place with creativity, with thinking, with headspace. So some of that's I did write portions of all my books here, but for the most part, it's kind of journalism that goes on in here.
So what is it about going away, George, specifically to Cornwall, that allows you to have that deeper contemplation time? Is it necessary to do that?
Well, different people, I guess, have different approaches. For me, the change of location is somehow signals to my brain that I'm doing something over and above my trade. My trade is collecting facts and reporting those facts in a way in which I think is accessible. I present Britain's most watched news programme, and so I collate those facts, I curate them. Now, beyond facts, and we can have a debate about this, people marshal facts in all sorts of ways, and the BBC has to curate it in a certain way, but there in writing, whether it's non-fiction or fiction, you're trying to go beyond just the fact and reach a kind of truth. And I think for me, the change of space, actually locating myself in a different space, helps me to get into that mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. So you are one of the most recognizable faces in the country. George, is that something you like on balance, or not like?
I think it's fair to say I never sought it. And early on in my career, let's go back to when I was applying to the BBC, I always applied for roles actually behind the camera, as it were. And partly, Anthony, that was about because I don't see myself as that kind of person, or at least I didn't then. And the other thing, and perhaps a more serious point is, and I'm going back here to the very late, the kind of 80s and 90s, I didn't think I'd get the job anyway if I asked to go in front of a camera, because they're just, apart from Trevor McDonald, there weren't anybody else. So that was a combination. But as I'm part of the furniture now, if you like. I've been in people's sitting rooms for the best part, one way or another, for over 30 years. And I've grown comfortable with it because by and large, people are very kind and they do treat me as a friend. I mean, I'll give you an anecdote. A camera man I used to work with quite a lot, got fed up with me turning up for, you'd go away for a week to wherever it was, Somalia or Afghanistan or something, and I'd turn up one day in a pink shirt, another day in a blue shirt, another day in a spotty shirt. And he said, mate, sometimes we have to cut some of what we shot today with some of what we're going to shoot tomorrow. And if you're in a different shirt, it makes life difficult. So I bought, a kind of dozen blue shirts, and that became a kind of uniform. But such was the relationship you build up with the audience and viewers, that I had a stack of letters from lovely ladies around the country saying, look, you clearly don't have enough shirts. You keep wearing the same one over and over. I'm very happy to take on your laundry and stuff like that.
Right.
So I always regard them as my friends now.
So is there a bit of an actor in you? And I say that in part because we first came across each other when you introduced me to the Royal Shakespeare Company as a governor. Would you like to have stepped the boards?
I did a little bit, tiny little bit, when I was at school, and it was Shakespeare, which involved wearing tights, and everybody said I didn't have the legs for it. So that was the end of my dramatic career. Having said that, Anthony, I mean, I think it's quite an interesting question, because in a sense, the person who sits at the desk, and as I will do tomorrow, for the news at 6, is not the George Alagiah you, Anthony, are talking to tonight. It's a slightly different George Alagiah. It's George Alagiah, the BBC journalist stroke presenter. And there is a slight difference between that. And the difference is there's an element when you're in the studio of performance, because you're not just, as I said, trying to convey facts, but you're also trying to suggest authority, suggest trust, suggest credibility, suggest authenticity. And you can't just do that by just plonking yourself and kind of reading what you've written a couple of hours before. There is an element of performance. So in that regard, I mean, I don't want people to think I go in there and I'm making it all up and it's all not me, but I don't know if you understand, if I've made it clear. There is a distinction.
So give us the George Alagiah face tomorrow that millions are going to see.
Oh my God. Well, it'll be something like today at 6.
So that, I mean, I'd not say that. Utterly essential. And if you were to play a Shakespeare character, if the Royal Shakespeare Company said, we have a dream for you here, what character would you like to play?
Well, the one I played, and I did get a little award for it in school, was Edmund in Lear. And we had a lovely English teacher. I mean, he's long gone now, a man called Ron Mills, who helped me through that process. And well, the way I played it, I mean, we are going back, I don't know, 45 years or something, or it was slightly less than that, but was, I mean, he is, yes, he's calculating, he's manipulative, he's devious, but when he dies, I think the way I played it, there was a recognition of kind of humanity and where he'd gone wrong and so on, and I enjoyed that arc, if you like. Yeah, so that I could reprise that. Well,
I guess we're going to have that, definitely. But was there any typecasting that you were cast as the bad brother?
No, I don't think it was actually. I mean,
it's more difficult. Interesting.
Even though I say this myself, I think as a person, as a character, he was far removed from the real George Alagiah. I mean, by and large, I think it's fair to say, a conciliator. I don't like confrontation. I don't like office politics. I don't like manipulating things. I like to talk frankly. And so no, I don't think I could get typecast as that kind of the Edmund type character.
So let's come back to the early George Alagiah and the sense of migration. Born in Colombo, Tamil family, 1955, and then 6 years later or so moved to Ghana, and then moved to Portsmouth in the south of England. What was that about, and how did that affect you? I mean, that's a lot to take on board, isn't it?
What it was about, and I think even as a child of 5, I kind of understood this in the way a child can know these things. So even as a child of 5, I think I knew that Ceylon, as it was then, was not going to be a happy place for us Tamils. And I didn't understand that, but I felt it. I felt it because I felt the tensions in my with my parents when they talked about their future and our future. And essentially, Anthony, that's why we left. I mean, there was independence in 1948, and it became obvious to people like my parents, and my father in particular, a public servant, that his career was not going to progress very far as a Tamil in what was increasingly becoming. This was the genesis of the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, if you like, something we've seen, of course, in different forms and different religions and so on, in kind of India, in Myanmar and so on. But that was what it was about. So my parents decided to leave, and my father just gave up his job. He had 5 kids to support. He didn't have a job to go to. Luckily, Ghana was Africa's first black African country, if you like, to gain independence. And as the British left, they needed teachers, engineers, doctors, and so on. My father was a civil engineer, and he got a job. And our arrival in Ghana in 1961 was, a lot of people talk about the dark continent, but for me, I could never ever see it that way, because for us, Ghana and specifically and Africa generally was a land of opportunity. It is where our lives suddenly took off. It is where, we weren't supermarket people in Sri Lanka, in Ceylon. We weren't wealthy enough, so there was a supermarket, but no, we were market people. My mum would go to the market and buy food on a daily basis. And suddenly, this is the sort of thing as a child I remember. We ran up the escalator at a shop called Kingsway in Ghana. My father was able to go and buy chocolates by the bar and give each of the 5 children, a bar of Cadbury's Dairy Milk. So that shaped my views, and perhaps we can talk about it later, about Africa. For me, it was not the dark continent. And then, of course, coming to Portsmouth, as you say, that was, my parents left Sri Lanka largely because they wanted for us the kind of education that Ceylon was once famous for, but which they didn't think would be available to us as Tamils. And I think they always, when they left Sri Lanka in 61, it was always in their mind that somehow they would make sure that we got an English education, and that's what took me to Portsmouth.
And St John's, and so just moving into the second area, a sense that you were for a different race, that somehow you were different. How did that dawn on you? How painful was that? How did you adjust your behaviours and your thinking?
Well, I mean, just imagine this for a moment, Anthony. You've spent 5 years traveling around Ghana in 3 different places: Takoradi, Kumasi, and then the capital, Accra. You have a back garden in which there's a mango tree, a guava tree, pineapple bushes, papaya trees. There was a dog, there were rabbits, there were chickens. And then suddenly, I remember getting into a minicab in London with my dad, driving down to Southsea in Portsmouth, and a chap called Lofty Eilert. His name was Eilert Eilertson, but he was huge, and everybody called him Lofty. And he was the prefect in our house. And he came along and shook hands with my dad, and my dad shook hands with him. And then the taxi driver sort of said, "All right, son, you'll be all right, won't you?" And he said, "Don't forget to wash behind your ears." And my dad hugged me. And then they got back into a cab. And I was left in this place where there wasn't a mango tree in sight. It was, it was a boarding section of what was then called a direct grant school. So most of the kids weren't boarders. There were kids from the services and 1 or 2 exceptions, people like me who were boarders, very small. I mean, our boarding house was an old Victorian house that the school had bought. But suddenly there I was, and had to make my way in this new world on my own. And Anthony, just for the benefit of our younger viewers, This is obviously pre-mobile phones. I mean, this is the era when you had to book an ordinary telephone call, and the most common form of communication was airmail letters. You know, these are thin blue letters that you just folded over, stuck down, and sent. So it was a massive change, and the change appeared to me most stark when I suddenly was reminded for the first time in my life that my skin color was different. And you know, for me, I'd never occurred to me, you know, and in those days there were communal showers, and I think you've got to have a shower about once every 2-3 days. But anyway, for my dorm, the day came along that it was our turn to go, and all the boys who'd been there before, I think there were 3 years in our dorm, they rushed into the showers and all sort of kind of got the best showers with the most water flowing and all the rest of it. Anyway, I finally got in. And remember, I'm an Asian. This is an Asian boy, a Sri Lankan boy, being naked in front of my own parents. Actually, was, you know, my parents would never have appeared without clothes in front of me. And even when I was being bathed at a well in the village of Kalmane, where my grandfather was, I would wear sort of underpants while he took the bucket out of the well and poured it over me to give us a bath, to wash us. So already this was very strange for me to strip off and stand on the shower. And then suddenly, remember, this is September, the first term, all the other English kids, the white kids, have turned up with a tan, except for where they had their, you know, their swimming trunks. And so they had these tan lines. And suddenly one of the boys pointed his finger at me and said, "Oh, you know, where's your tan line?" And this became a kind of refrain. You know, where's your tan line? Where's your tan? Why, you know, how come you're the same all over? And then another guy, who later became a great friend, by the way, said, "I know why he's hasn't got a tan line, because in Bongo land, where he comes from, they run around naked and they get the sun all over their bodies." And everybody, the shower room, erupted in laughter. And I didn't know what to do. I felt small, I felt weak, I felt insignificant. Nobody had prepared me for this. And inside, I was sort of seething, and I kind of told myself, I'm never going to let color be the thing that defines me. Outside, I didn't know what to do except to pretend I got the joke. And so I laughed as well, you know, and I look back at that, and I mean, it terrifies me now. I wonder how I ever made it through. Having said that, as I say, you know, today, Anthony, I don't know if you'd heard something like that at Buckingham or any of the schools you led, you'd probably call it racism. We didn't then. I didn't know the word existed. I still don't know whether, I'm not sure what it was, actually. It wasn't very nice. I'm not sure whether it was racist, but from that kind of shaped the way I decided I would navigate myself through Britain.
Tell us more how you made that, you negotiated that with yourself and the compromises you had to make.
Well, you know, you're on your own, imagine that, and really...
That's pretty brutal.
It is, I mean...
Even without the colour issue, I mean, Lofty was wonder if you did
Lofty
that.
Was a very nice man.
Victorian.
He was a very nice man, a very nice boy, and actually, about 3 years ago, I met him outside John Lewis in Oxford Street.
Still Lofty.
No, so I think, as I said, I decided colour wasn't going to be the thing that defined me. You know, it would have to be the athletics track or the classroom, but it definitely wasn't going to be colour. And remember, this is a time, we're talking 1967, this is a time when Britain didn't have a kind of a national consensus around race. There was no narrative that supported the presence of people like me in this country. This is still a time when, you know, black people, the Irish, and dogs were lumped in the same sort of category and told they can stay outside shops and so on. So for me, it seemed to me the only thing I could be was to, it's a word I didn't understand then, but to assimilate, to become English. And that's why when I finally got round to writing a book, you know, this is in 2006 or something, about multiculturalism, I called it A Home from Home, but from immigrant boy to English man, because that's actually what happened. You know, I set about becoming English. This accent that I'm using in our conversation, Anthony, I've no idea where it comes from. I mean, I don't know if you know Portsmouth, but it's certainly not, you know, and if you think, you know, there were something like exactly 700 kids in the school, 100 of whom were boarders. The accent, the predominant accent, was not the one I'm using now. And I can only think, because my sisters, 4 sisters, who also came separately to boarding schools here, I can only think that in that immigrant psyche, there is this strange antenna that's searching for the path of least resistance, and that somehow I locked onto this accent because it was a kind of an open sesame into British life, and it's worked, Anthony, in the sense that, and I'm not talking about professionally getting into sort of BBC or anything, though it might have played a part, but in this country, I think class trumps race. So when I used to go away once a year to go back to wherever my parents were, and they'd moved on from Ghana to Nigeria and then Zimbabwe, and I was coming back, I still was doing this on a Sri Lankan passport. So I was in that queue full of nervous people, sweating, you know, with brows sweating, thinking, what's the immigration officer going to say, and is he going to let me in? Despite the fact that I had obviously had some kind of stamp in my passport. But all I had, and this continued because in my early years at the BBC, I still travelled on a Sri Lankan passport, and I'd get separated from my crew who'd go to the EU / British line, and all I had to do when I got to the immigration desk was to say hello, and you could see the immigration officer think, oh my God, how do I treat this guy? Is he a foreigner or is he one of us? And almost always, in fact, always, the one of us thing was the way they reckoned up through the accent. Class, in other words, trumped race, and so yeah, it's worked in that sense. Whether you know people today may judge that journey, judge those choices. I mean, I didn't really see it as a choice. It was sink or swim for me, and they might think I sold myself short and my people short in becoming the person I have. All I can say is I didn't think I had a choice. It was the only thing I knew to do.
Valerie Amos, who we interviewed last month on the series, describes a similar process. She was in Sidcup with the family and had a very difficult time. Home from Home, you wrote, I think, after you went back to Sri Lanka, not exactly certain of the timing there, after the tsunami, which must have been your home was swept away, your grandfather's home.
Yeah.
How was that going back and seeing the impact of that devastating event?
Well, there's a couple of things I'd say about that. The first thing is that, you know, this is a country that I had not visited. I mean, you know, for long years, and partly because of the civil war and the kind of ethnic tensions and so on, it wasn't a place that we were routinely going. And one of the things that occurred to me straight away was, I mean, how should I put it? What I can only call a sort of umbilical connection to this country, though, which I didn't think I had, you know. But as I got off the plane, moved into Colombo, the smells of the breeze, the cooking on the streets and so on, even, Anthony, the language, which I had long ceased to use. I mean, I can understand Tamil, but I can't speak it. Even some of the words, I mean, kitchen Tamil, I'd call it, came back to me. So that was a revelation, actually. And in Home from Home, I tried to make sense of that. You know, what am I? Am I therefore still a Sri Lankan, or am I British or English? I mean, the other thing, of course, was, yes, the pain. I mean, of going back to this village, this fishing village, Kalmane, which was our sort of family home, in the sense that although my parents had moved to Colombo and my father worked in Colombo, my parents both grew up in the east of the country, in a city called Batikalo, and slightly outside of that was this place Kalmane. And I remember, you know, we'd done several reports by them, but we decided that day that maybe our audiences in Britain would be interested in me trying to go back and find my kind of paternal home. And I'd asked my dad about it from the hotel in Colombo. How do I find it? And he said, "Oh, just go down Rest House Road. When you see the rest house on your left, and slightly beyond it, the post office, just turn right, and we're about the third house on the right. And of course, we turned up and there was nothing. All those landmarks had gone. I couldn't believe it. All these childhood memories that I had, you know, of Culminate had just kind of disappeared. And I remember phoning we were at the time, obviously Sri Lanka's 5.5 hours ahead. This was early morning in Sri Lanka, phoning my father, poor old man, who was then, you know, living on his own as a widower, and saying, Dad, I can't, you know, where is this? There is no rest house, there is no post office, and I can't find the road. And he then said, look, maybe, do you remember the well where Upapa, which is what I would call him, would bathe him? And true enough, because Upapa, my father's father, he was a postmaster, and therefore had a slightly higher income than most of the people around him. So he was able to build a well with a concrete outside, you know, it was rendered in concrete. So it survived. I found the well. I could then see the footprint of our house. So yeah, there was a very, very difficult time. And it was, you know, as a journalist, it was an interesting thing, because I think it's fair to say my producer wanted me to reveal more about myself than I was comfortable with. And luckily he did push me. And certainly by the time we got back, and my inbox, you know, email inbox and letters and so on, I think most viewers found it was certainly an interesting way to connect them to the tsunami, because I was, as I said earlier, by then, you know, someone who they had in their sitting rooms for many years.
Incredibly moving. Let's move on now to military interventionism. Big jump, and Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, Sierra Leone, and others. Take us just a bit, George, through one or two of those experiences of being on the ground when the West had come in and tried to rebuild these countries anew.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing, of course, is one of the reasons I ended up coming to Britain at the time I did was there had been military intervention in Ghana, and Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah, Africa's first president of an independent black country, was toppled in a coup, and everything began to, you know, look chaotic. So my parents said, right, this is the time to get the kids off to send us to England. And since then, you know, that was my first inkling, if you like, of what military intervention can look like. And then, of course, professionally, as you suggest, I saw it happen many, many times. Now, I remember, by the way, I'm not seeking to be controversial in any way, and I think I'm right, and this is a slight digression, but so forgive me, but I remember a speech that I think it was Tony Blair gave. I think it was 1999, but you will know better than me.
April.
In Chicago, when I think he talked about humanitarian intervention. And the use of the military for humanitarian purposes and so on. And it was a brilliant speech, and it was one that, you know, I could see the sense of it completely. It had a coherence to it. The only bit of it, by the way, and this is why I say it's a digression, the only bit of it that I found slightly irritating is that it sounded as if he, or in the West in general, had invented humanitarian intervention. When actually, if you look at Africa, you know, one of the earliest examples of humanitarian intervention was this poor country called Tanzania intervening for reasons of defending human rights in Uganda, you know, under Idi Amin. So we you know, so it's an interesting thing. It wasn't invented by the West, so the West has done it in more recent years in all those countries you suggest. And I think the lesson, I mean, whether it's in Afghanistan, I remember, you know, being in Lashkar, for example, with British troops in Afghanistan, and there are two things about that experience, Anthony. I mean, sitting around a table with a bunch of young British men and women was one of the great privileges of my career. You know, we give young people a bad name, you know, they're either hooligans or they're drinking too much or, you know, whatever. And to see these young people performing their duty, even when in private they might have had some doubts, and I know some of them did have their doubts about what they were doing. What was just such, as I say, a privilege. But I mean, as I watched them, I mean, as we went on patrol with these troops, it was clear this was never, ever going to work, you know. And it's not just about the history of Afghanistan and the Russians and all of that sort of thing. Just if you take the Afghan intervention on its own without the history, you know, you can't do this with military boots. I mean, you have to have a plan after that. And of course, we saw that in Afghanistan, but more so in Iraq, that the plan wasn't there. And that if you have only military intervention, then what you can often leave behind is chaos. And I think Iraq is a classic case of that.
A terrible case. We had Christina Lamb talking about her own experiences. George, did you ever fear for your own life on any of your foreign news reportings?
Well, if you don't mind, I'll just get up.
And no one gets you from that door. You're safe. I'm covered on the door.
I'm going to get an exhibit. Exhibit 1, Anthony.
Exhibit A.
Is this satchel okay?
No,
it was a satchel that went around me wherever I travelled in the world. And the answer to your question is, I was in Afghanistan. I think this was 1994. We were billeted in a house with a street about, I don't know, 20 feet wide, and I was there on my own with a cameraman, Ian, and we were getting up. We got up one morning. There'd been shells flying. Neither of us had slept. I mean, there was a civil war. There were shells flying over us all night, and opposite us was somebody we knew who could help us get to somewhere we were going to. So I came out of the house we were staying in, started walking across the road, and halfway across the road, realised that, having agreed with the cameraman I'd meet him outside to go on and get on with our day's filming, I realised I didn't have my satchel, my work satchel. I went back towards the house we were staying in, and that very second, a shell went through the front door of the house where I would have been standing there knocking, you know, and I always think that day someone somewhere was looking after me, and it was quite interesting. Ian and I got on with the day as if nothing had happened, and then about 2 hours in, I was doing what we call a piece to camera. That's where the reporter actually talks to the camera, and I couldn't get a word out. And that's when we both realised how traumatised we had been by this. And he then talked to me about the fear he had, because he just thought, he didn't realise I'd come back and I'd been thrown, you know. So yes, it was a dangerous place, but of course we were there because we wanted to be there. We were there by choice, whereas so many of the people I was reporting on didn't want the war, didn't want to be separated from their loved ones, didn't want to see the blood and the gore and the carnage. And we have to remember that the people who suffer most, obviously, are the locals.
Absolutely. Do you still believe a providential force was looking after you?
Well, I don't, as it happens, believe in God, but I've had a lucky life, I think, Anthony, and I can't explain it in any other way. I mean, just to imagine, I mean, what, you know, literally we're talking seconds, so who knows. I mean, I don't dwell on it a lot, but I understand in a way, perhaps that others don't, that I've been blessed, and when I look at the life that's unfolded for me after that event, yeah, I am blessed.
You interviewed many of the most significant Black and African and other figures, including Mandela, including Tutu, including Kofi Annan, including even Robert Mugabe. If we were to pick Mandela, you were there in Joburg for the BBC between 94 and 98. And that included seeing the World Cup South Africa win. And had you met Mandela before you saw him there in the jersey?
Yes, I had. I mean, I had the privilege of interviewing him, well, being in his presence and throwing questions at him many times, but interviewing one-on-one, certainly twice, possibly 3 times. I think 3 times. And so I had met him, and of course, one understood, this figure of towering moral authority, this man who knew how to walk the extra mile to reconcile his people, as he saw it. But even knowing that and having heard him talk about that, him coming out in Francois Pienaar's jersey, the captain's jersey that day, and hearing Ellis Park and saying, Nelson. I mean, look, I don't. If you had a camera at the back of my head, you'd see all my hair standing up. I can't talk about it without the tingle. I mean, he was talking about interviewing him. He was not, I would say, the most pleasant or easy interviewee. I've got to say, because it's fine on a news story, you're just lobbing a question, and whatever comes back, it's 12 seconds. You smack it onto the tape and edit it, and it's out there on the news at 10 or the news at 6. When you do one-on-ones, you're looking for depth and something personal, and Mandela would not, or I think could not, bring himself to talk personally, because I think there was so much pain there. This was a man who I think he acknowledged towards, later in his life, had kind of abandoned his young wife, Winnie, and had not been there for his daughters, for his children. He had children by another marriage. So I think it was very difficult. Tutu, on the other hand, was marvelous. I mean, he was such great company. He would. Can I tell you a little story?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So the first time I met Archbishop Tutu, I was with my crew. We'd gone down to the Bishop's Palace in Cape Town. We'd flown down there from Johannesburg. So there was myself, there was Milton Nkosi, my producer, Jerry Tabani, there's a sound man, Glenn Middleton, a white South African, who was my cameraman. So we turn up at the Bishop's Palace, and there's Archbishop Tutu with somebody else. And I, say hello, Archbishop, shook hands and say, this is Glenn, this is Jerry, this is Milton. And he said, oh, well, very good, and that kind of impish way he has. And he said, very good. Well, my name is Tutu, and this man over here is number 222. And he immediately kind of cut through any kind of inhibitions any of us had. And we sat down and had a wonderful interview. Yeah, well, he was a man, I think, who kind of understood the complexities of life, of the sacrifices that you make, the compromises you make, and was willing to talk about them in a very open way when you're dealing with struggling against something like as pernicious as apartheid.
And then presenting, and is that frustrating to have such an active intellect? How much freedom do you have? You clashed a bit with the BBC over fair trade and the extent that you could have your own political views and causes that you wanted to advance while having to maintain that impartiality. How difficult has that been, George?
Well, let's take it to the first bit. What was the transition like from reporter to presenter? And I think that the honest answer to that, Anthony, is I was ready for a change. And I remember the day I was a foreign correspondent, getting a call from my foreign editor asking me to go to some other to a place I'd been before, actually, a place called Kisangani in what was then Zaire and is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I heard myself saying no before I'd actually computed it in my mind. And I think what had happened there is I realized on reflection afterwards, I instinctively knew that I no longer had the language to describe this cruel world that I was reporting on, that I was going back to places for a second, sometimes third time, places like Southern Sudan, Liberia, Rwanda. Of course, I'd only been once, but you know, you have to find a fresh language to describe what's going on, and I just didn't think I had it in me anymore. So it wasn't a kind of great traumatic moment. People sort of talk about, and I'm not belittling it, you know, post-traumatic stress. I mean, you know, in the job that I was doing, and lots of much braver reporters do. But I think it was a moment. So that transition suited me, actually, when the BBC said, well, would you want to try your hand at being behind the desk? Now, the other question you ask, of course, is, as a foreign correspondent at the BBC, you are given quite a lot of freedom. I mean, unlike the American networks, for example, where you have such a thing as script approval, a correspondent and somebody from ABC or NBC would be the next sort of tent along in somewhere like Rwanda, and we'd obviously talk, and I'd write my script, and my colleague at NBC at one of the American networks would have to stop about 4 hours before I stopped, because they had to send the script off to New York, and they had it approved, and then there was a lot of toing and froing. The BBC gave you, you know, they appointed you and said, okay, you're supposed to know about this thing, you're a specialist, and we will go with it. So we had a lot of freedom. Now, as a presenter, and that freedom is, the premise behind it is that you are an eyewitness. You're reporting on what you can see. You're not delivering opinions, but you're making a judgment on what you have smelled, touched, felt, and spoken about. Now, as a presenter, you don't have that. You're one step removed, but you're doing something, as I said earlier, that is equally important, is you're curating all that information. You know, you're saying to, in the case of the News at 6, as I say, which is the biggest program, you know, millions of people every day, sit down with me, trust me, I'm going to take you through the day's news, and understand that my colleagues and I, brilliant people, my editor and I, we've thought very carefully about this so that perhaps you don't have to do it quite as much. And that's a really important job. And to do that job, you can't have views. You know, we live in a diverse country with diverse, and not just diverse, but sometimes divisive views, as we've learned over the last 4 years or so. So I have one day I'm going to write a book and say all the things I would have liked to have said instead of the scripts I did write. But no, I understand that why impartiality is important, and I hope I've delivered that.
Do you get nervous? Did you get nervous? Are you going to be more nervous tomorrow in front of millions than you were tonight with us?
You know, the heart does thump a bit faster and a bit harder, and I think that's probably a good thing. I mean, I'll let you into a little secret. So these are programs news programs are done live. All of it is done live normally in normal times, except for the headlines, which obviously, I mean, I've written, you know, you've written everything, so you've got it in your mind. But I mean, you write the headlines, but in normally you get to rehearse the headlines, which is about a minute's worth of the program out of something like 26. Now, in the time of coronavirus, where we've only got one studio running at the moment at the BBC, literally one presenter gets off and the other one goes in, and there's only enough time for the floor manager, the only other person in this room now, to clean the place up, to make it COVID safe, for you to sit down and then deliver the news just like that. There is no rehearsal. So yes, my heart does thump a bit harder nowadays.
And so we've got, that's a confidential between you and me and the 6,000 people who are apparently watching this. There are over 4,000 screens on, and 1.5 per each one. Can I just say again that if you want to ask a question, I have been feeding them in, by the way, while George has been talking, then send them. If you can't, if you're not on a Teams system, send an email to matthew.thompson with a p.ac.uk. Can we just have an extract from the novel because The Burning Lamb, which came out in 2019 and paperback in 2020, is so compelling. And we were going to have 3 extracts, but you've been so beguilingly interesting that I haven't left enough time. So can you pick one of an extract to give us?
Well, let me. So the book is a thriller, and it's about the rich world and rich people buying land in poor countries from poor people. And as climate change unfolds, I think we will see this more and more. And at the centre of this there's a murder that kicks off chaos in the country in South Africa. The book is set in South Africa, and there are 2 people. One, a woman from Britain, from London, who goes down. She's into conflict resolution, and she meets someone locally, a man called Kahiso, and together they have got to save themselves because they find themselves at the centre of this conflagration, and the country they both love. And it's a terrible situation they find themselves. And my character Kahiso, whose job is to work with the rural poor, help them with negotiate bank loans and the rest of it. And we were talking about Mandela's time, help in the past, before this had happened, had helped to bring people together, farm workers with farm owners and so on. And he thinks back to this time in this time of chaos with some kind of sadness, but also fondness. So we're talking about this man Kahiso. He remembered the time when he'd helped to organise an end of harvest braai, South Africa's version of a barbecue, on a farm right on the border with Mozambique. It was the first year of a profit sharing scheme that Kahiso had helped put together. The area had been blessed with good rains and a bountiful crop. That evening, as a blood orange sky had turned purple, as shadows grew longer and fainter till they just seeped away into the soil, one of the migrant workers had brought out his mbira, a traditional handheld musical instrument, a finger piano as some called it. Kahiso had sat on the edge of the group, entranced by this vision of a different future. The farmer and his wife, Afrikaners both, sat near the fire. On the other side of the circle, their children huddled next to the housemaid and some of the workers' children. An old man, rheumy eyes staring into the embers, pulled at a zol, a homemade cigarette spiced with the comforting fragrance of dacha. Women spread polyester blankets over their bare legs, and young men shared the last few bottles of beer. Calloused thumbs plucked at the metal tines of the mbira, shaped like the flat handles of tablespoons, and picked out a tune that had been written in another century in the great language of the coast, Swahili. Nobody understood the words, but all were moved by the ballad. The lament of a young suitor who knows he will not wed his angel, his malaika, for want of a good fortune. Kahiso had looked across at the farmer and was sure he'd seen the man's eyes well up with a tenderness so far removed from the caricature of his people. The morning, he knew, would expose again the starkness of his country's struggle to find a middle ground between great wealth and great poverty. But for that evening, under that deep and star-studded African sky, Kahiso let himself dream. Yes, dream. Dream of another country, one in which hope triumphed over despair and idealism scored a victory over cynicism. There you go.
Very moving, and there's lots of applause, which I'm sure you're picking up in Hackney at the moment from around the country and beyond. And George, that just takes us into the last area, which is your cancer. You 2014-15 seemed to be on top of it, and then it returned, and then in June 2020 you wrote that it was in the lungs and lymph nodes. You seem very strong and very together about it. How is that, George?
Well, I think I've learned a lot, and if I'm not breaking any confidence, I mean, it's a journey that you've been on yourself, Anthony, as a carer.
So my wife had it for 5 years and died 4 years ago. So yeah, sure.
And I think the thing I have learned, two things. I had to reach what I call a place of contentment, because all sorts of things go through your mind in those early times. Anger, what did I do wrong? But I basically literally sat down and wrote 2 lists, the pros and cons of my life. And by the time I'd finished, this is back in 2014. It took me some months, by the way, to do this. And I understood and realized that there were way more things in the pro column than in the cons column. In other words, that I had a good life, and I got to this place of contentment. And look, people deal with cancer in a way that works for them. This is what worked for me, and it's what stayed with me. It's given me a calmness, if you like. The other thing, which I think you will understand, is that this business of vulnerability, accepting vulnerability, and then the richness of the relationship you can have with those who care for you. In the first instance, it is my wife, who you saw accidentally a little while ago. I mean, she's been on this journey. Imagine what it is like for her to have the man, you know, she married all those years ago, over 30, nearly 40 years ago, to have his life threatened, and the fortitude that requires. And so I've had a new appreciation for what it must be like for those who care for you. And all I can say, Anthony, is that, I wish I'd never had cancer. I really do, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone else, because the treatment is ghastly. It has been difficult. I've spent 3 months this year on some very heavy treatment when I had to. Nobody saw me. It was very heavy, and then I'm on milder treatment now. I go for chemo in a week's time again. I have it every 2 weeks. So I wouldn't wish it on anyone. I wish I'd never had it. But do you know what? If you said to me, do you wish you'd never gone down this journey? I'm not sure I'd give the last 6 and a bit years back, because I do think I'm a richer person for the experience. I mean, I wanted to go on, and I want my brilliant doctor to find new ways of treating me, or new combinations of the same old drugs that might continue to have an effect, or miracle of miracles. Let's say some bright spark in some laboratory somewhere comes up at the Crick Center or something, comes up with a new drug. But for the moment, anyway, I am content to have had this experience and believe I am a better person for it.
Your optimism is extraordinarily inspirational. Your life force, George. Kim says, George, you're looking so well. Really pleased to see that. Paul says, George, you're an inspiration to us all. But somebody else wants to say, Luke wants to know, what was your biggest gaffe? So Luke's not interested in how you are. He just wants to know, when have you really done a dobber as a presenter? Thanks, Luke, for that.
Well, I don't know about as a presenter, actually. I don't think I have had one of those horrible, moments when your tongue declares independence from your brain. There is something I do regret as a reporter, and this is covering the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, when lots of people fled to neighbouring Zaire, Congo now, and in there were perpetrators of violence and the victims of violence. They're all in one place, and then cholera hit the camps, and I don't think I did enough as a reporter to help the audience understand that some of these people were genuinely victims, others were there because they had been part of, they had either through acts of commission or acts of omission were guilty of being part of the genocide, and that stayed with me, because you only have one chance at this as a foreign correspondent, and luckily, it is only the first draft of history, so plenty of people, I mean, even myself, days later, I think I corrected it. But I do remember at the time thinking, do you know what, I got that wrong. So no, sorry, I know you were looking for a gaffe. I can't think of one particular. No. So I have made mistakes for sure.
Casey says, fantastic talk, George. Thank you very much. Hongbo, who's an academic here at the University of Buckingham, says, as a person from an ethnic minority group, do you think your own culture is a gift, or more of a gift, more of a burden, or neither in your own career?
Well, I have come to understand, Anthony, that it is a gift. Having spent the early part of my life in Britain, as I say, being this person who was trying to fit in, I took all the cultural references of my old life, and I include the African bit of it as well, but mainly I bundled it up, if you like, in a bag and put it in a kind of mental attic and left it there. And then I began to explore it much later in life, when I felt confident that my Britishness, that I could own it and nobody could take it away from me. And then I began to explore it, as I did in A Home from Home. And I now regard it as a privilege. I mean, what an amazing, amazing gift to be able to say, I am at home in Accra, I am at home in Batticaloa in Sri Lanka, but this country, this wonderful country that has given me opportunities, how lovely it is to be able to call this country my home. You know, so I think it is a privilege now. I've come to understand that.
And Jake's asked a similar question. Laura and Mark are asking about the cancer. By the way, I'm going to stop, if you're okay, George, until 3 minutes past. I normally stop on the button of 1 hour, but we did start for 3 minutes late. Laura's partner is diagnosed with cancer. I'm very sorry to hear that, Laura. And she's wondering about coping advice. And Mark's asking about how hard for your family, including the children.
Well, as I say, I do think, and this is something that I think is important. I do think it is harder. I really do think it is harder for those around you. And I think, yes, we are victims. We are the ones with the cancer. But I think we also have, in my opinion, and I don't want to sort of start preaching to people, but I think part of our job as being patients, as people living with cancer, is to make it easier for those around us, the people who care for us, to understand how difficult that job is and how frustrating it can be sometimes. You know, to think, oh, the drugs have worked, and then suddenly 3 scans down the road it doesn't work, and what's going on in their minds. Luckily for me, our children were in their mid-20s when I was diagnosed. It was something they've been able to understand. And the other thing I've decided is that I'm going to live life to the absolute full. And one of the things that's helped me, because I became, in 2018, became a grandfather, and this lovely, and there was something, you asked whether I believed in God, or in terms whether I believed in God earlier. I don't know about that, but there was something spiritual about, as one life was struggling, as one life was waning, this lovely little granddaughter burst forth, full of energy and new hope. And do you know what, Anthony? She was 12 days late, and she waited for my birthday to be born. So
hey, which was 22nd of November.
Exactly.
I remember that the date of Kennedy's assassination.
Exactly.
Coincidentally, but now a happy day. You can now choose. Just got time for one question. Ollie says, "Do you think the Iraq War was actually about oil, rather than the professed reasons given?" Whereas Sophie said, "What was it like talking to Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe?"
Well, I know we're running out of time. All I would say is, at the time I talked to him, it was in the 80s, and here was a man who, one always remembers the Mandelas, but before Mandela there was Kenyatta, there was Nyerere, and there was Mugabe, people who tried to extend the hand of reconciliation. Now, I'm not making any excuses for Mugabe. He became a tyrant and a despot, but in those years, in those early years, I don't think white people in Zimbabwe understood actually that they too had to play a part in the transition. That if 4,500 farmers were going to sit on not only most of the land, but most of the best land that something had to give. I didn't like the way Mugabe did it. I reported on it, but white people needed to have understood that. And I'm sorry to say, but you know, South Africa too, and that's why I wrote this book, The Burning Land. I mean, South Africa too has to confront that. You cannot have, for all the reasons, and we know all the reasons to do with conquest and colonialism and so on, you cannot have the best land in the hands of a few people and expect everything to carry on as normal. So in those days, actually, he was, you know, he was already doing some pretty awful things to, you know, there was ethnic tensions even in the 80s, but the balance, there was a balance then. You kind of thought, well, maybe, you know, the good will come out. Sadly, it didn't happen.
So before I just ask you one final question, can I say that talks coming up include Africans Coming to Europe by Olivette Atelli. We've got Charles II's Sex and His Mistresses, and we've also got St. Paul by former Bishop Tom Wright. So a Catholic range, and Nick Heitner also coming up very shortly. Do join us if you'd like to attend any of those. But George, that was a profoundly moving talk on many levels. What do you want? Last question. What would you like your legacy to be? What has George Alagiah meant to the world? The many millions who've seen you.
Oh my gosh, Anthony, you've saved the toughest question for the last.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure. Look, what is my legacy? I did my best, you know, and I think that's it. You know, it's been quite a ride. It's been a remarkable journey, you know, for a boy who started off in a house where there was a bucket for a loo, to end up where I am. I would say, if anything, my life proves that nothing is certain, but everything is possible.
And the fact that here you are, one of the best known faces, and indeed one of the most admired and trusted figures in the country. You wouldn't want that to be your legacy, George, but it is true. George Alagiah, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you.